Okay, I'm Peter Reese. I'm from Stanford. So I have two sets of questions, but I think I'll just start with one. Implicit in what each of you has talked about, I think, is the notion that groups form with some sort of goal in mind. And in particular, Sandy sort of, I think, touched on this topic, which is, he has a notion of a rational participation model, and that's familiar to economists. And so there's this notion that groups ultimately have a goal. What are groups trying to achieve? And it sounds like you're sort of touching on the idea from the title of the talk that it's some notion of identity. So an economist would think about it as, well, people rationally want to participate in groups if they're going to invest in creating an identity. And so that, again, speaks to a notion of what the goal of the group is and how you align individual incentives to participate in the group with the notion of what the group as a collective is trying to achieve. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, and also comment on this group boundaries issue, because, for example, you got into an interesting discussion about how, for example, physical characteristics can be used to define groups, but there's also issues that groups define subgroups, which is interesting to me. So blacks, for example, there are black Muslims, there are black evangelicals, so you can have religion as a sort of subclassification. And so if we sort of think about groups as having goals, how do subgroups arise, and what are the goals of subgroups? So I don't know if that's an intelligible question. I'm curious as to whether you have any reactions to those.
You want me to start? Okay. So first, let me take what I think is the easier question first, which is the question about subgroups. So the phenomenon of subgroups really is associated with what I think social scientists now are referring to as intersectionality, which is the fact that any particular individual has multiple identities in some sense, or there are multiple groups that this person, any individual can be associated with. So it could be a religious group, it could be a group that we refer to as a racial group. It could be individuals who are alums of a particular university. So what's, I think, really critical from the standpoint of stratification economics is isolating which identities are salient for producing significant penalties or significant privileges, because all identities are not equal. They're not equal in terms of their social consequences for the individual. And so it's not necessarily clear to me that the Uber group defines the subgroup. An individual may become a black Muslim because they are part of the black community, and there is a religious group that has emerged that is specifically targeted at blacks, although Islam in general is not. And so it's not always going to be the case that the subgroups are a construction or a creation of the Uber group. The process of group formations is really quite complicated, and so, but I think it's the intersectionality analysis that's really crucial in terms of dictating or determining which identities are the ones that bear cost and which ones bear benefits to individuals, and how that plays out when a single person has a mixture of those identities. Now, the other question though is groups having goals, and I guess I didn't think of the group's goal as identity creation. I was thinking more that one of the characteristics that defines the group is the particular identity that may be socially constructed, or it may be jointly constructed by the members of the group themselves. But the goals have something to do with what relative position you want to see your group achieve. And that's somewhat different from identity construction in and of itself. So I guess I'm thinking about the goals in a somewhat different way.
Follow up with an example, which the example I had in mind is, for example, how different groups use music as part of this group construction. So I think of that as very much in this spirit. For example, there's gospel music, there's rap music, there's all sorts of different types of music that various groups and subgroups can use to sort of create an identity or reinforce an identity as a group. So I think of that as that's kind of an investment activity. That's why I'm curious as to whether you think of groups as having goals and how those goals align with sort of what individuals are going to do when they decide I want to participate in this group or multiple groups, and sort of how you think of that sort of alignment process.
Well, we've got an expert on the social context of music. I'm not sure. I mean, music is not always used for purposes of group mobilization. Okay, I mean, there's kind of a raw entertainment dimension to music as well. And in terms of the groups that coalesce around particular musical forms, that gets really tricky also, because I guess the majority of listeners of rap music are young white males. So I'm really not sure how to sort of handle. I mean, there's two different issues. One is the construction of a musical genre, whether it's what we now call classical music. What are the processes that created that, coming out of the high courts, of Europe and so forth, versus music that emerges in some sense from the bottom. So that's one issue. But once the music form is in place, then there's another set of issues about how it's circulated and who comes to appreciate it and what its consequences are. So I'm not sure I want to make a direct tie-in between a specific group and music per se. So that's a very complicated one.
I don't mean for you to take it literally in terms of music. I mean it to offer it as an example about how. So if we think of this question of identity, identities don't just happen. People or groups create identities, and they do it through different things. Music might be one, or it doesn't need to be. So there are different identities. The
identities that I'm personally most interested in are those identities that are associated with the construction of patterns of social hierarchy. And so what are groups about in that context? They may be trying to construct another group's identity to make sure that there's somebody that they can exploit. They may be resisting that exploitation. And so the group goals revolve around relative position in the context of a social hierarchy. And that's what I'm most interested in terms of the kinds of groups that I want to explore. Yeah.
So I was just going to jump in to add a little bit. I don't know if I'll be able to actually deal with the question about kind of goals, but I wanted to talk about, Sandy mentioned this idea of intersectionality, and I guess I would think of kind of identities from larger groups and subgroups as being layered, right? In the sense that, you can draw upon a particular smaller boundary group, an ethnicity or national origin, or you can talk about this larger boundary or racial grouping like Asian American. Or a racial category. So I guess I see the subgroups and the groups, the identities that they're associated with, they're not mutually exclusive. They're layered. They can be drawn upon during certain, sometimes they'll have to be drawn upon if someone describes certain characteristics you are true to in a particular way. But I guess I'm trying to think about it in a more fluid way. So it's not that, and it could be that subgroups and larger groups have goals that align, right? So I don't think they're always going to have very different types of goals that are going to lead them to be in conflict. But again, sometimes they do. But I think that's what social scientists and sociologists are starting to think about. For a long time, we just thought about groups in terms of racial categories, right? We didn't think about the dynamics that were occurring within those racial categories. And at least for me in my research, that's what I'm trying to do, to think about, well, how is it, and maybe this is where your question stems from, how is it these groups are operating that they can organize together when they may have very different interests from each other and from maybe these kind of ethnic leaders or ethnic entrepreneurs who want them to have particular goals or interests. So I think it's a question that I don't think there's an easy answer for. I mean, Sandy was saying it's very complex. It is complex, but I think that these are the types of questions that I'm definitely interested in, and that sociologists are interested in. But I do think Sandy's point about the racial hierarchy and where you are located in that racial hierarchy can be associated with particular types of interests, right?
Yeah.
And how you're going to ascribe certain characteristics and maintain your group position. So I I know that maybe doesn't move forward, but I guess I'm hoping it adds to the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think it brings in, I mean, what I hear in what you're saying is also a sort of ecological analysis about sort of what's the context in which this group formation is happening and what might the goals be. And I think of it from a more developmental perspective about there's certainly a lot of psychological theory about what motivates people. And we think about child and adolescent development and young adult development having some sense of purpose and a sort of group affiliation is important in a lot of different basic sorts of ways for human beings. But when I think about the teenagers whom I work with, there's a lot to do with, if we take the example of gang identification and gang formation. I mean, a lot of it's protection in a certain kind of environment and people identifying as norteño or sureño or whatever. You have to sort of understand what's happening in a neighborhood context and also what's happening sort of much more in terms of the larger environment. But I think that there are specific goals, sort of safety goals, that form some people to cluster. But I think the identity and the sense of purpose also provide other kinds of meaning goals for people, or at least satisfy different kinds of sense of meaning about what people's life is about and why they're here, et cetera.